Welcome.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just share my slides and get my slideshow going. Here we are. Um, share. So, okay, you all see that? So good. So yeah, Nadezhdin has been kind of a perennial companion throughout my scholarly career, and I've wrote about him in a variety of different contexts. But today I'm actually not going to talk about ethnography, which is usually the context I talk about Nadezhdin. I'm not even going to talk about his notorious, fateful love affair in the 1830s with Elizaveta Sukhova-Kabylina, which led to much of his misfortunes. But I've actually been thinking more about crime and punishment and redemption and forgiveness and clemency and friendship and betrayal and all these sorts of things, which I'll bring into the discussion today in various ways. So start off kind of with a historical stereotype. The regime of Nicholas I was not known for its kind and gentle and forgiving nature. Nikolai, of course, was deeply shaken by the events of the Decembrist uprising, and it left its imprint on his reign. The struggle against revolutionary conspiracies and subversive ideas was a dominant motif throughout. Harsh censorship was the rule of the day throughout his regime, and even the most innocuous references could evoke the suspicions of the secret police, the infamous third section led by Nicholas's trusted agent, Alexander Benkendorf. Petty infractions might be let off with a slap on the wrist, but major violations of the social and ideological order, crimes of state, were punished severely, and the punishment generally was permanent. Even when violators were released from prison or returned from exile, the stain of unreliability hung over them, precluding the possibility of a career in state services. There may have been some exceptions. I can't think of many. There was, of course, Nicholas's gesture of mercy toward Pushkin, allowing him to return from his exile after the two met in 1826. But of course, Pushkin's offense was against the previous ruler and falls more into the category of youthful indiscretion than state crime and conspiracy. It's true, some of the Decembrists and other political criminals served in local administration in their places of exile, but they did this under close observation due to the shortage of educated people in the provinces. And none of the Decembrists, to my knowledge, were pardoned and allowed to return during Nicholas's lifetime. Alexander Herzen might be one possible exception. He served briefly in St. Petersburg after returning from exile in Vyatka, but he remained under surveillance and was soon arrested again, demoted to a position in Novgorod, kind of a second exile, on the basis of information from a perlustered letter. And Herzen's crime also was relatively minor, and he was very well connected. As a general rule, it was very difficult to wash away the stain of unreliability. One figure who stands out as a notable exception is Nikolai Ivanovich Nadezhdin. Nadezhdin was the editor of the journal Teleskop, who made the fateful decision in 1836 to publish Pyotr Chaadaev's incendiary philosophical letters. It was, as Mikhail Vilizhov has aptly noted, an act of professional suicide. Chaadaev's text was immediately denounced in broad circles of Russian society as an unforgivable insult to Russia's national honor. The complaints soon reached Nicholas I, who didn't hesitate to pass judgment. The writer might be a madman, that would be determined, but, quote, the editor and censor are not to be excused. Nadezhdin was arrested soon after and sent to St. Petersburg, where a detailed investigation was launched. The Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov, in particular, went to great length to show that this publication was not an isolated blunder, but rather a blatantly subversive act driven by hostile political intent. Nadezhdin's tortured attempts to account for his action and show his loyalty only made his situation worse. After over a month of hearings, the ad hoc tribunal proclaimed its judgment. Nadezhdin was to be exiled for the indefinite future to the remote town of Ust Sysol'sk, in the northernmost reaches of Vologda province. And here's a map for you so you can see where Ust Sysol'sk is. Here's the capital of Vologda. The capital city is on the left, and Ust Sysol'sk was actually some 800 vyorsts, which I guess is probably around 500 miles or so, to the northeast of Vologda. So it was quite remote. And this sentence was the culmination of a string of failures and misfortunes, as a result of which Nadezhdin's once enviable social position as a university professor and editor of a respected journal came crashing down. He set off for the frozen lands of the Komi-Zeryan people in deep disgrace and practically destitute. Yet, for Nadezhdin, there turned out to be life after Ust Sysol'sk. 10 years later, not only had he returned from exile, but he had accomplished a striking rehabilitation. He had forged a new scholarly identity as an ethnographer, become the leader of the first major scholarly institution devoted to the field, the Ethnographic Division of the Russian Geographical Society. Moreover, he had worked himself back into the good graces of the Nikolaevan regime and attained a high position in the Ministry of Internal Affairs under Lev Perovsky, first as editor of the minister's official journal and then as an official for special assignments. His restoration to favor was sealed in 1846 when he was promoted to the rank of state councilor and awarded the rank of the Order of St. Anne in the second degree. And 5 years later, he became an active state councilor, which that's you really make it when you're an active state councilor. So how had Nadezhdin accomplished this impressive comeback? Not only restoring his previous status, but actually far exceeding it. How did he convince the regime of his reliability, and what was the price he had to pay for his return to the good graces of the regime? These are the questions I would like to address in this presentation. 6 points in particular I would kind of put forth by way of explanation, and in the process of expounding on them, we can trace Nadezhdin's career path in the years following the Chaadaev affair, something which incidentally has had quite little attention in the scholarly literature. So, first point, what I'm calling the will to reconciliation. It may seem like an obvious point to make at the outset, but for Nadezhdin to restore his reputation vis-a-vis the state, he had to want to do this. And we can't automatically assume this was the case. Under the sort of prevalent historical trope, the reign of Nicholas I is viewed as the period of the parting of the ways, to quote Nikolai famous book. This is a time when educated Russian society supposedly turned its back on officialdom and began to follow its own separate path, autonomous from and often in opposition to the state bureaucracy. And an iconic figure in this regard might be Vissarion Belinsky, Nadezhdin's protege, who steadfastly avoided state service and eked out a meager existence as an independent journalist. Nadezhdin does not fit this mold. The image of the proto-intelligent, proudly eschewing the interests of state and keeping contact with officialdom to a minimum. Two things in particular set Nadezhdin apart. First was his age, and second was his social origin. Nadezhdin was born in 1804 in the village of Bielo-Amut in Ryazan province, son of a village priest. His formal education took place almost entirely within the clerical estate, from his first schooling to his graduation in 1825 from the Moscow Ecclesiastical Academy. The bursa and the seminary were a world apart, sharply contrasting with the educational practices of the nobility, both in its harsh physical regime and rigorous inculcation of knowledge. And unlike the first generation of the intelligentsia, the Belinskys, Aksakovs, Granovskys, Chaadaevskys, etc., Nadezhdin came of age in the 1820s. before and around the time of the Decembrist uprising, when the aura of the Napoleonic Wars, the patriotic fervor coming from Russia's victory over Napoleon was still palpable. He entered Moscow society in the late 1820s as an outsider with a brilliant intellect, encyclopedic knowledge, abundant energy and ambitions, but still rather naive and inept when it came to the manners and mores of noble society. Nadezhdin's response was to turn his disadvantage into an asset. Through his work as a teacher and writer, he presumed he would bring true enlightenment and aesthetic refinement to the shallow youth of the nobility. And one of the symptoms of the cultural immaturity of the nobility, in his view, was their lack of patriotism and loyalty, most vividly displayed in the Decembrist revolt. Although Nadezhdin developed some heterodox views, largely informed by his reading of German idealist philosophy, he never saw his philosophical worldview as standing in opposition to the state and the existing political order. This was, in fact, one of the most distressing aspects of his predicament during the Chaadaev affair, that he, of all people, should be accused of political disloyalty. In short, ideological convictions were not an obstacle to Nadezhdin seeking a rapprochement with the state. So what else did he need? Well, friends in high places helps a lot. Nadezhdin may have had the desire to attain rehabilitation, but this was not something he could easily do on his own, especially while in exile. It was essential that he have advocates, individuals of high standing and repute who could advance his case and vouch for his reliability. Fortunately, Nadezhdin had a gift for eliciting the friendship and loyalty of people in high places. He may have cut an awkward figure in the salons of the Moscow nobility, but he excelled in attracting important people to his side in less refined settings. He was a lively conversationalist, erudite, witty, intelligent, tolerant of different views. From his early days in Moscow, he excelled at making friends among his peers and retaining their loyalty. Now, in the wake of the Chaadaev affair, he would need these friends more than ever. Nadezhdin's Moscow friends, especially Sergei Aksakov, with whom he was particularly close, provided assistance with finances and logistics. But for aid in alleviating his political predicament, he would need help from friends closer to the center of power in St. Petersburg. A trip to the capital in early 1835 had provided the opportunity to make some important connections. Most significantly, it was there and then that he made the acquaintance of Dmitry Maximovich Knyazhevich, who would prove to be his most reliable ally. Knyazhevich at the time was serving as director of the State Treasury Department, but in his early years, he had participated in literary circles. A very refined person. His brother Alexander at the time also held a high position in the Ministry of Finance. When Nadezhdin met the Knyazhevich brothers, he had already resolved to leave his position at Moscow University and was seeking an appointment as a vice governor or someone of a similar rank. Although the Knyazhevich brothers promised to help, they were unable to find a suitable spot, but Dmitry was able to offer an enticing alternative. He was planning a trip to Europe and suggested that Nadezhdin might join him. So the two spent the second half of 1835 on an epic trek through Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria, and southern Russia, Ukraine, before heading home. The time spent on the road strengthened their acquaintance into a powerful bond of friendship that lasted until Knyazhevich's death in 1844. Nadezhdin's arrest and exile did not shake his friendship with Knyazhevich. Knyazhevich actually visited Nadezhdin while he was under investigation in St. Petersburg, and the two kept up a regular correspondence during Nadezhdin's exile. And Knyazhevich was not content just to bolster his friend's spirits. He also took concrete steps to bring him back. The details are unclear, but it appears that Knyazhevich, together with Yakov Rostovtsev, another important person that Nadezhdin attracted to his side, the two of them submitted a petition requesting leniency, possibly up to a full pardon, while Nadezhdin was in exile. But Nadezhdin was not just relying on the efforts of his friends in St. Petersburg. He had another line of attack from his place of exile. Even before he arrived in Vologda province in early February 1837, he made a concerted effort to court the favor of the provincial governor, Dmitry Volgovsky. In a letter written just after his arrival in Vologda, he made a plea to be allowed to stay in the provincial capital, clearly playing on the governor's vanity. He wrote, "Under your direct supervision, I would bear more firmly my misfortune and would strengthen in spirit sooner, so that in accordance with the paternal will of the merciful monarch, I can make amends for my guilt and turn with renewed and worthy force to the service of him and the fatherland." Now, however, we might cringe at Nadezhdin's obsequious tone, and it's even worse in other passages. His appeal had the desired effect. Flattery works sometimes. Several weeks later, Balgovsky, now in St. Petersburg, presented a petition to Count Benkendorf requesting that, given the desirability of, quote, turning the talents of this writer toward the benefit and glory of our gracious fatherland, that Nadezhdin be allowed to stay in Vologda under his direct supervision. An addenda was soon added, noting that due to poor health, Nadezhdin's departure to Ust Sysol'sk would be delayed until April 30th. Despite Balgovsky's efforts, the response, at least initially, was lukewarm. The response back from Benkendorf was that Nadezhdin was to remain under regular police supervision, and Benkendorf reported that he did not feel he had the right to make a presentation to the emperor on Nadezhdin's behalf. Evidently, his view was that Nadezhdin would have to at least fulfill the letter of his sentence before clemency could be considered. He would have to go to Ust Sysol'sk. It wasn't until July of 1837 that Nadezhdin actually departed. First, it was his poor health, then quarantine due to a measles epidemic, and finally spring floods and the onset of the mud season. Nadezhdin joked he might have to swim to Ust Sysol'sk if he had to leave any earlier. During this time, Nadezhdin became a welcome visitor in Balgovsky's home, charming local society with his conversation and wit. When he finally left for Ust Sysol'sk, Balgovsky sent instructions ahead that he be greeted not as a state criminal, but as an important visiting official. Sure enough, when he reached the town, he was given an honorable reception and lodged in the best house in the town, which probably wasn't saying much. Nadezhdin spent his time in Ust Sysol'sk churning out encyclopedia articles to pay his debts while conducting ethnographic research on the local Zeryan people. But his goal remained to make his stay as short as possible. On August 31st, he wrote again to Balgovsky requesting that he be allowed to return to Vologda. He emphasized above all his desire to atone for his guilt. He wrote, "I would not fear death in this remote wasteland. I fear only to leave on myself the stain of my unfortunate misdeed." Balgovsky dutifully submitted a petition on Nadezhdin's behalf, along with an attestation to his good behavior, and this time the results were favorable. On October 29th, 1837, Benkendorf reported to the emperor on Balgovsky's petition, and a few days later, Nicholas gave his response: "Approved, but keep under strict surveillance." It wasn't until January that Nadezhdin was actually able to return to Vologda. Still, Balgovsky's willingness to intercede on Nadezhdin's behalf was not exhausted. In March, he returned to St. Petersburg and requested through Benkendorf a full pardon for Nadezhdin. Several weeks later, Nadezhdin received permission to live wherever he desires. So this was his first stage, being able to leave Vologda to return from exile relatively quickly. The next point I would bring up is the role of bureaucratic infighting and staying on the right side of these bureaucratic disputes. It was one thing for Nadezhdin to find support among officials like Knyazevich and Balgovsky, who were willing to go out on a limb for him and petition for his pardon. But this does not explain why these petitions were so readily accepted. Here we need to consider the bureaucratic patrimonial culture of the imperial court and the ways in which the Chaadaev affair intersected with the existing rifts and points of tension within the highest circles of the bureaucracy. Autocracy, as many scholars have pointed out, was predicated on the ability of the rulers to act as an arbiter between competing centers of power and personal ambitions. The regime in this regard represented not so much a unified facade embodying the will of the autocrat as it did an arena in which disparate forces maneuvered and collided, seeking to place themselves in a more advantageous position vis-a-vis the autocrat. The Chaadaev affair was woven into these competing bureaucratic interests, and its course was determined to a great degree from the interests and agendas of the key players. Mikhail Velizhov suggests that we view the affair as a battle between three powerful forces. Sergei Uvarov as Minister of Public Enlightenment, Sergei Stroganov, the curator of Moscow Educational District, and Alexander Benkendorf, head of the third section of his master's chancellery, the secret police. Uvarov tried to present the publication of Chaadaev's letters as the product of a political conspiracy to undermine the regime in general and his authority in particular. The implication would be that the third section was at fault for not uncovering a dangerous plot. Likewise, Stroganov, who was responsible for the censorship of Telescope, was responsible for the failure to stop the letter from appearing in print. For Benkendorf, on the other hand, it was advantageous to show that Uvarov was going too far, reading too much into Chaadaev's letter and its publication. He could not, of course, contest the seriousness of the letter itself, but he was much less inclined to see sinister motives behind its publication. The view of Nadezhdin as a gifted and well-intentioned scholar and editor who had fallen prey to a serious lapse of judgment was more in line with his strategy. Nadezhdin himself did much to promote this view of things, this image. During his official investigation in November 1836, Nadezhdin was lodged in the home of Leonti Dubelt, Benkendorf's top assistant in the third section. Here, Nadezhdin applied all of his social talents toward ingratiating himself with Dubelt and his superior. In letters to his friend Aksakov, which almost certainly were read by the officials before they went out, he describes Dubelt as a man with an excellent heart, educated, intelligent, kind. Nadezhdin describes Benkendorf as strict, but only without cruelty, on the contrary, with a clear sympathy for my misfortune. Even in the aftermath of the inquiry, Benkendorf's softer position was evident. It was Uvarov who chose the location of Ust Sysol'sk, but Benkendorf later ruled that Nadezhdin would be allowed to write and publish while in exile and that he could return to Moscow before his departure to put his affairs in order. Overall, Uvarov's efforts in the Chaadaev investigation were successful only partially at best. He was able to discredit Nadezhdin's efforts to present himself as kind of holier than the Pope on the issue of official nationality, but he was never able to make his accusation of a conspiracy stick. Still, punishment had to be meted out, and once the emperor's will had been voiced, it could not be countermanded. But after Nadezhdin had been to Ust Sysol'sk and the letter of the sentence had been fulfilled, mercy could be evoked, the punishment could be eased. By petitioning and attaining a pardon for Nadezhdin, Benkendorf was striking another blow against his rival, signaling that the Chaadaev affair had not been such a threat after all. Okay, so next issue is biding his time. Nadezhdin's reprieve did not resolve in any way his prospects for the future. He returned to St. Petersburg in very poor health, fighting a flare-up of severe rheumatism that left him bedridden for several months. From his bed in his hotel room, he held court as an array of writers, journalists, and officials came to pay their regards and hear how the famous professor had survived in the wilds of the far north. The attention and amiable company was a comfort, but it did not help resolve his uncertain future. His pardon had only specified that he could choose where to live. It said nothing about whether he could return to state service. One form of state service which he categorically rejected was going back to teaching in the university. This would put him in the service of Uvarov. And after what seemed to Nadezhdin to be Uvarov's malicious betrayal in the Chaadaev investigation, he wanted nothing more to do with him. Another option would have been to stay in St. Petersburg and try to survive as an independent literator, an editor. This would have made for a very meager existence, and he probably didn't even want to ask for permission to start a new journal. Once again, his friend Dmitry Maximovich Knyazhevich came to the rescue. The previous year, Knyazhevich had been appointed curator of the Odessa Educational District, a position of considerable responsibility. From this secure position, he was able to invite Nadezhdin to join him as his personal assistant. With no alternative prospects awaiting him, Nadezhdin readily accepted his friend's proposal. He left for Odessa with Knyazhevich and his family in October of 1838. But Nadezhdin's position in Odessa was ambiguous. As Knyazhevich's personal assistant, he had no official appointment, nor would he have accepted one, since it would have put him under the jurisdiction of Uvarov. Living on the largesse of his friend as a member of his household was not a sustainable long-term prospect, but in the short term, it allowed him to bide his time, let the dust from the Chaadaev affair settle, and wait for a more favorable opportunity to seek a permanent position. During his time in Odessa, in addition to assisting Knyazhevich with his duties, Nadezhdin worked to burnish his scholarly credentials. One of his initial tasks was to edit the Odessa Almanach, a yearly publication of learned and literary works, which Nadezhdin hoped would enhance the region's reputation as a center of enlightenment. Nadezhdin himself contributed several sketches, mainly focusing on the history and geography of the Black Sea coast. Soon, however, a new opportunity arose with the opening of the Odessa Society for History and Antiquity to pursue his interests in a more serious academic setting. Nadezhdin quickly took on responsibilities, editing the Society's journal and serving as one of its leading members. He contributed several scholarly works, including a major study of Herodotus and his travels in the Black Sea region. In 1840, Knyazhevich was able to secure funding from the Society and the Ministry of Education for a year-long scholarly expedition with Nadezhdin through the Slavic lands of southeastern Europe, which brought abundant scholarly rewards. These activities were pivotal in Nadezhdin's effort to forge a new scholarly identity for himself as an ethnographer. They did little, however, to launch him on a new career path. Upon his return to Odessa, it became clear that his position was becoming untenable. His prominent position in the society and his close connection to Knyazhevich evoked the jealousy and suspicion of other members, who accused him of driving the curator to financial ruin and undermining his health. Whether or not there was any truth to these allegations, he could not continue to live indefinitely on the largesse of his patron. Enough time had passed for him to seek a service opportunity elsewhere and resume his career. Knyazhevich attempted to secure for him a position in his district, but in the meantime, Nadezhdin made a trip to St. Petersburg to seek out opportunities there. We don't know exactly the details of what transpired, but evidently his trip was successful. In early 1842, he was offered a position by Lev Perovsky, Minister of Internal Affairs, to manage and edit the ministry's in-house journal. So he had a chance to make himself useful. The position that Perovsky offered Nadezhdin in many respects was an ideal fit. Perovsky was in the process of building a ministry that would become a refuge for many of the most forward-thinking and progressive members of the state bureaucracy. Dubbed the enlightened bureaucrats by Bruce Lincoln, many of them would play key roles in the development of the emancipation settlement. For the time being, however, the ministry cultivated a positivist ethos, whereby decisions about Russia's internal affairs would be driven by a wealth of accurate empirical data. The ministry's journal, which Perovsky hoped would prove to be a worthy competitor to Uvarov's Journal of the Ministry of Education, was to be a showcase of the sort of rigorous data-driven analysis underlying the ministry's work. Nadezhdin, with his years of experience editing Telescope and his own considerable intellectual achievements, was very well suited to his new responsibilities. But his place within the ministry, initially at least, remained tightly circumscribed. His editing responsibilities took an enormous amount of time, especially since he actually wrote and rewrote much of the journal's content. This may have been intentional, since the stain of the Chaadaev affair may still not have been fully washed away. Perovsky, in fact, before agreeing to hire Nadezhdin, made inquiries of the third section as to his status, whether there was any reason why he shouldn't go ahead with the hire. He received a quick response drafted by Dubelt and corrected by Benkendorf, confirming that the pardon Nadezhdin had received did not include any limitation on the service he might undertake, and therefore could not constrain him from taking on whatever was offered to him. So Nadezhdin's work with Dubelt and Benkendorf continued to pay rewards. The way was clear, but Nadezhdin still remained outside the realm of policy and leadership, with all of his time consumed by his editorial task. For him to rise to a position of responsibility, he needed to show once and for all his absolute loyalty to the regime and his willingness to take on any task that was required of him, regardless of any ethical considerations. Just such an opportunity presented itself in 1865. So now, finally, Nadezhdin has the chance to prove his loyalty. His burden as an editor of the Journal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs eased somewhat in early 1845 when the young Orientalist Vasily Grigoriev, whom he had met in Odessa, was hired to serve as his editorial assistant. This allowed him to undertake other tasks, which the minister assigned to him. Perovsky was especially concerned with matters of religious dissent. And Nadezhdin, with his training in theology and philosophy and his research skills, was well situated to provide this assistance. Nadezhdin's first task was to provide a report on the Skoptsi, the sect of self-castrators. Initially, this task had been assigned to his colleague, Vladimir Dal, who had just produced a notorious study on Jewish ritual murder. Dahl was pulled off the project, however, when Nicholas I learned that he was a Lutheran and insisted that the report be compiled by an Orthodox believer. Nadezhdin took Dahl's material and expanded it into a much more lengthy and detailed study, which remains to this day one of the key historical sources on the Skoptsi. Soon, however, another more pressing task arose concerning old believer communities just across the border in the Austrian territory of Bukovina. In 1844, alarming news reached St. Petersburg. A group of old believers in the village of Biela Krynica had attained an audience with the Austrian emperor and received permission to establish an old believer bishopric. If this occurred, old believers would be able to ordain priests to serve the numerous priest-taking or popovtsy communities within the Russian Empire. By the start of 1845, leaders of the community were engaged in an active quest to find an appropriate Orthodox bishop who could be induced to join the community. Preventing this required active measures, and after his successful conclusion of his report on the Skoptsi, Nadezhdin was given the assignment. Unlike his previous study, however, which was based mainly on written sources, this task would require undercover investigation on site. Nadezhdin's ethnographic experience prepared him well for the task. He had a particular scholarly interest in the people of the regions, the Rusini, whom he felt had a special connection to Russia. So in the summer of 1845, Nadezhdin traveled to Bukovina and under the guise of a visiting scholar spent several weeks in Biela Krynica, getting to know the members of the community, including the leaders, gaining their trust and learning the details of their plan. All of this information was presented in a detailed report published by the ministry in a very small number of copies and presented to the emperor along with a memo from Perovsky emphasizing its importance. Nadezhdin's report is a masterful account, clearly written, engaging, detailed, and thorough in its analysis. It's also somewhat ambivalent in its approach. When speaking directly of the old belief, Nadezhdin does not hesitate to use the most violent, hateful language, directly echoing the rhetoric of the official church. The sect was, he asserted, like a stinking scab covering up an old and festering wound. Yet, when speaking of members of the community as individuals, he often describes them in quite a positive light. They're sober, industrious, intelligent, and devoted to their Russian cultural heritage. The threat they presented to the empire was not so much their beliefs as such, but rather the political danger they posed. The existence of a secret network extending throughout the empire, working from a home base abroad with the support of a foreign power. That was how Nadezhdin framed it in his report, and this was sufficient for Nadezhdin to recommend severe repressive measures. And the following year, in 1847, when a high-level delegation of old believers from Belaya Krynica was captured in Moscow, Nadezhdin was able to provide detailed information about the specific individuals in question and make recommendations as to their punishment. Nadezhdin's uncover investigation of the old believers marked his unconditional acceptance as a trusted agent of the autocracy. For his efforts, he was well rewarded. In 1846, he was promoted to the rank of State Councilor and received the Order of St. Anne in the second degree. He had come full circle, from a victim of political repression to an agent of repression, from someone suspected of conspiring against the state to an investigator dedicated to rooting out conspiracies. Needless to say, none of the old believers caught up in the dragnet received anything close to the clemency Nadezhdin himself had received. Nicholas, in fact, personally intervened and imposed sentences far more severe than what Nadezhdin himself had recommended. Why had he taken this path? A phrase that strikes me is surrender of the will. A slide here. Maybe not. In the Chaadaev affair, he encountered an instance in which his individual reason and judgment had led him to take a course of action that had proven to be disastrous. The consequences seemed to have sowed in him an aversion to abstract reasoning. In his scholarship, he completely abandoned the metaphysical frameworks that he had used to structure his previous work and turned to concrete empirical studies in history, ethnography, and geography. In his personal and professional life, he rejected the play of abstract moral reasoning, you might say in a sense a conscience, and elevated the state as the arbiter of the good. In that sense, it almost seems like he followed a right Hegelian path, seeing the state as the ultimate incarnation of world reason. His personal task then became to bring himself back into a state of harmony with world reasoning by making himself an instrument of the autocracy, surrendering his will to the gravitational pull of reason. Now, returning to this topic has made me think a little bit more deeply about the nature of clemency and forgiveness in autocracy. Actually, in contradiction to what I said at the outset, starting to think it may not have been as rare as I initially thought. And in fact, it may actually be integral to the dynamics of autocratic rule. The autocrat, by definition, is not bound by any of the regulations, procedures, and rulings imposed through the bureaucratic system. In this sense, as others have pointed out, the system is predicated on a rickety balance between the mechanistic regularity of the bureaucratic apparatus and the arbitrary personal interventions of the autocrat himself. Clemency was one such intervention, a demonstration that the autocrat has the power to negate his own judgment in the interest of a higher justice. Nadezhdin was fortunate that he fell on the merciful side of the autocratic will. But his reconciliation had a price. Even during his lifetime, there were murmurings about his perfidy in stoking the fires of repression against the old believers, his personal betrayal of his informants in Belaya Krynica, good people who had gained his trust, was especially shocking. By the 1850s, these acts of personal betrayal on behalf of the regime were decidedly bad form, and it only got worse. In the literature of the late imperial period, Nadezhdin is not treated kindly. Pavel Milyakov uses him as a negative example to highlight the virtues of Belinsky. Mikhail Lemka, author of the fundamental work on the Nikolaivan secret police, openly despised Nadezhdin. Even other more sympathetic observers, such as Nadezhdin's biographer, Nikolai Kuzmin, simply cut his biography off with the Chaadaev affair, as if to say whatever happened after that is really not worth discussing. Nadezhdin may have thought that by surrendering his will to the right reason of autocracy, he was absolving himself of moral responsibility for his action. but the just judgment of history has begged to differ. Thank you. I'll end it with that and look forward to Bella's comments.
Nathaniel, thank you for that really fascinating and somewhat sobering talk. Bella.
Yes, thank you, Nathaniel, for this really, really interesting, really rich presentation. And thanks also to the organizing committee for engaging me to be собеседник. I have sort of comments, questions to share in a couple of different areas, and I must say that I had thought of the presentation initially when you had shared materials with me as being very much concerned with ethnography. So some of my questions will reflect that, but I've also tried to recalibrate since you began by saying it's, this is maybe not a space where you want to think about ethnography or when you're foreground ethnography. So I've been thinking about various contexts, I suppose, into which this work you've presented may be placed and how the work might shed light on the contexts and vice versa, and a kind of process of mutual illumination. And so I hope we can linger over some of these ideas, concepts that seem to me most important in the narrative you've presented. I should say I share these, thoughts really for group discussion, and I would hope, Nathaniel, that you respond to whatever seems most interesting or relevant to your larger project, and probably not everything I say will be interesting or relevant to the larger project. So I was really prompted by your presentation to think about power. In Nikolaev Russia, spaces of power, distributions of power during this period. You note a number of times that Nadezhdin had friends close to the centers of power, and you explain, I thought very, very helpfully, that his case should be considered in the context of being embedded in a kind of bureaucratic infighting. So what inferences might we draw from this narrative then? So for example, I'm wondering whether it would make sense to think about the networked, multi-agented nature of power during this period, which may or may not be how we have typically thought about autocracy. In other words, with Nicholas's reign, I do think that we've thought typically about a notably repressive iteration of autocracy, and the example of Nicholas and Dostoevsky's death sentence springs to mind, right? It is narrated usually as a dramatic encounter between the Tsar and the writer, and it seems as though the Tsar has sole power over whether it's, death sentence or exile and so forth. And I very much realize this is the high drama version of what happened. And my point partly is that it may be a mirage. So that maybe what your account unravels is the always multifocal networked nature of agency and power, and even of autocracy, as a kind of distributive power network at this time, which would be in line with, to my mind, really illuminating narratives about, say, autocracy as compromise, as we find with, say Whitaker, right, in a much earlier period. So this notion that autocracy is not the exercise of power by one individual in an absolute sense, it seems to me at least really generative and potentially not as surprising as we might think, even in the case of Russian autocracy. So that in this case, pardon and rehabilitation become possible through many actants dispersed throughout the empire, as you've described, even if, of course, they must ultimately be signed into existence by the autocrat. I have questions about Nadezhdin's social estate. I was wondering how his social estate might have been one of multiple mediating circumstances through which he experienced his political rehabilitation. I realize, and I think you mentioned this somewhere, that he would have left the Soslovia in which he was born, right? But did he experience his social origins? Did he leave a paper trail, rather, about experiencing his social estate or origins as something that mediates his experience, let's say as a scholar, as a journalist, and so forth? And where might we find evidence of this? I think of, say, Ivan Goncharov, who is a bit younger, but in the 1840s and 50s, very much an enlightened bureaucrat, also a non-noble, also somebody who left the state into which he was born, which in this case was the merchantry. And I'm just wondering about the sources from which someone like Nadezhdin would have derived a sense of self, like the sources from which he would have shaped an experience of himself. Is it scholarship? Is it service? Is it actually the experience of political repression? I'd love to hear more about what service means to Nadezhdin, in part because you seem to be establishing a contrast between Nadezhdin and Bedinsky, with the latter's career emerging primarily in the print media environment, which is not state service. But of course, we know of a number of writers, of literati, of journalists, both prior to and during Nadezhdin's lifetime, who spend a long period of time in state service while simultaneously being productive writers, and who derive a sense of social or writerly self, from potentially an aggregate sense of their activities, both in service, let's say, as a censor, and their activities as a person who writes. So I'm wondering about the dynamics between service and writing, or service and participating in public discourse. I was particularly interested to read and to hear about his unwillingness to work anywhere under Uvarov, and I'd love to hear more about that. I was very engaged by what you had to say about Nadezhdin's wit and his sociability, and at the same time that you make reference to his kind of outsider status in a way among the empire's cultural elites, which of course would have been still noble at this time, predominantly noble. And I'm wondering if Nadezhdin's particular ability to navigate various social spaces, networks, and so on might prompt us to think about the period's social fabric in new ways that might be foregrounding the business of an imperial administration as something that perhaps gave rise to particular social spaces that we don't probably emphasize enough when we think about this period. If you like, I'd love to hear more about Nadezhdin, the journalist. It seems like being a journalist was both what got him in trouble and also what enabled his rehabilitation to a certain extent. I really appreciate what you say about the parting of the ways narrative being overemphasized in a way. And so I appreciate very much your inclination to inscribe Nadezhdin into a larger narrative about educated, capable participants in Russian public discourse and scholarly life who are not parting ways with the regime. And so I'm wondering if there's a connection to be made between imperial government, particularly the high information technocrats, if I may use the term, and which I hope is aligned with how you're thinking of them, and ethnography and political rehabilitation. And so lastly, I did find myself having like this whole set of questions about ethnography. So I thought initially that perhaps my most important question would have been, what's the role of ethnography in the account you've presented? And what might be the relationship between ethnography and political rehabilitation? If you wanted to tell us more about the origins of ethnography as a 19th century Russian practice, like should we be thinking about it in the context of other late 18th and 19th century practices that have to do with collection, the curating and circulation of knowledge, to my mind, that would be really interesting. Are there originary moments in the history of ethnography as a Russian practice that might help us understand its political meanings and its relationship to Nadezhdin's political rehabilitation? I think this was in the written version. You had said interesting things about, of course, Nadezhdin's relationship to romanticism. And of course, it's hard to think about to not think about romanticism as linked with ethnography. So I wonder about romantic collecting, and it seems very different kind of ethnography he's engaged with. And I would love to hear more about ethnography as part of, again, imperial administration. I'm wondering how you would define the iteration of Narodnost that existed in the 1830s and 40s, and whether you would consider its relationship to the conceptual category of the imperial generally and to the business of administering the empire specifically. I'm wondering if in what you were looking at in Nadezhdin as ethnography, if there's a tension between Narodnost and the imperial margins. Right, so ethnography is something concerned typically with the margins, although not necessarily, and Narodnost is something concerned with the narod. So a kind of interplay between the national and the imperial, and I wonder whether that's a thing that you see play out in any of Nadezhdin's contributions. Lastly, I was intrigued by the mention of Herodotus, and it's hard not to think of classical antiquity is vitally important in 18th and 19th century articulations of the ethnic and the national. And so I would love to hear more, if you have time, about Nadezhdin's work with Herodotus and how it may or may not fit into this narrative. Is this another narrative about a modern ethno-national state or tradition being articulated via some kind of engagement with classical antiquity, which we see so much in the late 18th and early 19th century? And so In other words, is writing about Herodotus's Scythians a way to write a national or an imperial narrative, or in fact, better, do you want to reformulate this question away from that contrast between nation and empire and towards something else? And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Carla, thank you so much. We'll give the floor to Nathaniel to answer for a sec and then open it up to questions. Thank you. Oh, you need to unmute. Nathaniel, you need to unmute.
Okay, great. Hear me now. Yeah. Thank you so much for those questions. It's a lot to talk about. Before I dive in, I forgot at the outset to thank Sarah and Anne and Margaret for inviting me and organizing this. I've been wanting to give a talk to 19B for a long time, so I'm glad to finally have the opportunity, and also to Sasha Spitalnik for organizing everything so well. And of course, Bella, for these wonderful questions that are just so on target. You really touched on a lot of the things that are really fundamental to what I'm thinking about and working about here. So I don't think I can do justice to all of them, and I do want to hear what other people have to say, but I'll try to make a few forays at it. First of all, the nature of autocracy, and autocracy as a kind of networked distribution of power. And yes, I absolutely agree. And this is actually, it's a pattern that has been noted in many periods of Russian history. There's an extensive literature about the 17th century structures of power that look very similar. And then, of course, the Nikolaevan era, and in some ways, I think this model works today in Putin's Russia. Looking at the ways in which this central all-powerful figure facilitates the creation of networks of power, patronage networks, circles which are kept in this kind of tense equilibrium amongst each other through their relationship to the central point. And so it's important not, to keep in mind the role of the center, because even though the power is spread throughout this network, and in many instances, the structure of autocratic power can actually replicate itself on a lower level, particularly with people like provincial governors who are acting with a lot of autonomy in their own special region. But without this central figure, the whole thing falls apart. But there's an interesting point as well, and actually Misha Velizhov brings this up in his book, that in a certain way, this setup, this need to balance, to mediate between these different networks, actually hamstrings the autocrat. Because if you show too much favor to one particular side in this balance, then you throw the system out of whack. And you create the conditions for political instability, which can actually potentially take down the autocracy itself. So in an odd way, this system is predicated on the absolute power of the autocrat, but also constrains the autocrat in the ability to show favor too firmly to one side or the other. Really interesting point. And yes, the Dostoevsky death sentence I think it's a perfect example of the kind of arbitrary nature of mercy and clemency in the way it's given and taken away in very unpredictable situations, which actually is a way of kind of theatrically demonstrating the absolute notion of the autocratic power, precisely because it is so arbitrary and capricious. So you asked about Nadezhdin's socialist state, and yes, that is a major factor for him. And there is a paper trail in some senses that there's some letters where he mentions meeting someone else from the clerical estate, and he says there's kind of a Freemasonry among us. These people from the clergy who had been through the seminary, been through the bursa, they have this imprint on them. It's evident in the way they talk. It's evident in the way they behave themselves in polite society. With Nadezhdin, it's even evident in his handwriting, which is this strange kind of block print, which actually is a blessing for me because it makes his writing much easier to read. But nonetheless, that's not the way a nobleman would write. And it was a disability for him in in the noble social spheres. And I think gender is an issue here as well, because in the spheres that were not as heavily gendered, that involved women as well as men, his social awkwardness was more of a disability. But the state bureaucracy was a very male sphere, and it was a sphere that was very much engendered around learning and professional skill and those sorts of things. And those are the kind of spheres that people coming from the clerical estate actually tended to thrive in. So I think Nadezhdin found that the bureaucratic sphere was a much more conducive milieu for him to pursue his interests, rather than the noble social sphere, where he was really an outsider and much maligned. In Moscow, he really is becomes very much persona non grata in Moscow social circles. He wouldn't serve under Uvarov. That was one of his absolutes. The other thing is he would never go back to Moscow after the Chaadaev affair. So yes, and yes, literati in service, absolutely. You see this all over. I've always been skeptical of the parting of the ways narrative. I think in some ways it's projecting a later intelligentsia mentality on the 1840s, where it really hasn't taken root and things are much more fluid. And so there is yes, a lot of right. That being said, certainly in the Ministry of Interior Affairs and other ministries in the Nikolaivan regime, especially after 1848, writers are viewed with great suspicion. There's an incident where Vladimir Dal is actually informed upon. Someone from another branch of the bureaucracy writes to Perovsky, Dal's supervisor, and said, "Did you know that this Vladimir Dal, who's working for you, actually writes stories? You have to forbid that." And Dal was actually, he was reprimanding for publishing short stories in sort of non-governmental journals, and actually left the ministry and went to Nizhny Novgorod, and that was the end of his career as far as I know, as a writer. He continued to be a philologist and did his dictionary and his collections of folk tales, but he never wrote fiction again, as far as I know, after that moment. Nadezhdin too never wrote essays, belles lettres. He actually has a fictional work he wrote right around the time he entered the ministry, but that was the last one he ever wrote. His whole self-identity as a literator really fell by the wayside once he entered state service. So a lot I could say about the role of ethnography, but I don't want to take too much time. But I do want to pick up on the idea of Herodotus, and because that is really interesting, because Nadezhdin, with his clerical education, had a perfect knowledge of Latin and Greek. He wrote his dissertation in Latin. And when he taught at Moscow University, he taught aesthetics largely based on the ideals of classical antiquity. So classical antiquity played a huge role in his early career. And first thing he did when he got to Odessa was to write a big biography of I'm sorry, just blanking on the name, but Catherine's favorite, who founded Novorossiya. Potemkin, of course. Yeah. He wrote a big biography of Potemkin, and sort of Potemkin, of course, was involved in the Greek project and the whole project of using the acquisition of Crimea and southern Russia as a way of connecting the Russian Empire with the legacy of classical antiquity and Europeanness, in a sense. And so then, of course, the next big study he writes is Herodotus. And sort of taking Herodotus's observations of the Scythians and the Black Sea coast and trying to kind of impose that on the map of the Black Sea coast as it currently existed, almost sort of putting, inscribing Herodotus and the whole heritage of the Greek world back into the Russian Empire. So I think it's a really interesting point. So I'll leave it with that, and look forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Thank you so much. That was lovely.
Yeah, we have time for questions. I'll give it a second and hold back on my own. Do I see any little orange hands waving? Oh, Allison Smith. You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
There we go. Hi. Thanks so much for this, Nathaniel. And I have a really weird question because I think my AC's paper is about Nadezhdin, which I had not realized, because it's about some writings from the Journal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in the 1840s, and in particular, a series of articles about accidental death. And I would just wonder if you could talk a bit more about this idea of him. You know, I've come across these references to him basically rewriting or writing vast amounts of the content of the journal during those years. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about that as I'm trying to make my way through dealing with these. Again, they're all anonymous. They all clearly are written by the same person because they have this sort of, it's a very odd tone that is simultaneously very serious and very tabloidy, like sort of like, here is this wacky death that I must like tell you about to horrify you. And this means something really serious about the nature of the Russian man or something like that. And I'm just trying to make sense of how to think about these. So if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and they're really weird and they're really bizarre. Like, here's a story about a man who pulled a worm out of his neck, and here's a story about a man who is. Oh, there's one about a man who was struck by lightning or something like that, and then he something like he had this religious, there's a religious aspect to it. But yeah, I think I agree that probably certainly Nadezhdin would have had a hand in writing these. The period when he was most involved in the hands-on management of the journal would have been the period before 1845, and also after 1851, when Perovsky leaves and Bibikov comes in as the minister, and he is a tyrant and forces Nadezhdin to go back to working on the journal. And but I think he set the tone. And I think what's happening is that the ministry, gets all these reports from the provinces. And so and they were probably, files in the ministry that he could use. And then so, came up with this way. And it is tabloidy. He was certainly interested in increasing the circulation of the journal. And this was one way to do it. Although on the other hand, he wanted to make the journal recognized as a serious outlet for the production of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, particularly knowledge produced through the ministry. So it is a little odd, and maybe I'll try to catch your paper at AC's and hear what you have to say about it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Looking for other questions too. Well, in the meantime, I have one myself, although it's not so much a question, it's just a thought, and that is thinking about Nadezhdin. I did not know that he was tasked with studying and then targeting these old believer communities, and it's pretty much the same as what Nikolai did, right? 10, 15 years later.
Yes, they worked together actually.
So they worked together on this project?
Yeah. I think Miliko-Pechersky got involved in it slightly later.
Yeah.
And he was involved in the kind of 2.0 version.
Okay.
Because what happened with the Bielokrinitsa incident is that essentially they got their bishop and they started ordaining priests, and the government was actually put a lot of pressure on Austria to try to shut this down. And they were right about to do that when suddenly 1848 happened. And at that point, it just, everything. So they were able to keep producing their bishops, as far as I know. So that issue actually, there was kind of nothing more they could do about it after 1848. And I believe, actually, poking around the internet, I think there's still old believers in Bielokrinitsa to this day.
Wow.
Now it's in Western Ukraine, and it is a major center of the old belief. But I think they became interested in the Biguni, to the different sect of the old believers, and they investigated in particular colonies of the Old Belief, particularly the Beguine, in Yaroslav province, and they sent a delegation down there, and I believe Melnikov-Pechersky was much more involved in that aspect of it. And here, Melnikov-Pechersky's background as a writer with ethnographic interests played very much into his role in studying the Old Belief, because it is an ethnographic task in a sense, and not only are they simply trying to arrest these people, but they're also learning about them, and studying their theology, their way of life, and large parts of that went into Melnikov-Pechersky's writing. Particularly his writing about the merchantry in the Volga region, and that was a social milieu that was rife with Old Belief. So Nadezhdin is not the only one who kind of, is engaged in this overlap between ethnography and the study of the Old Belief and the repression of the Old Belief.
Which parallels, I think, what happened, say, in North America, right? I mean, you study the native people as you facilitate their extermination also, often, or as you are sort of like, in the sort of later stages of containing them or getting rid of them, they become very interesting ethnographically, and you're doing all of this cataloging. And one of the things that this paper is extremely interesting to me, and also very sobering in many ways, but one of the things that interested me about Melnikov, and it sounds like I'm not sure this happened with Nadezhdin, is the people who write about his work repressing the Old Believers, and the people who write about his fiction, there's almost no overlap. I mean, it's like they're separate things that happened, and as you're pointing out, they're not separate at all. So this is very useful to me. Thank you.
It is. And one of the things that's interesting is this ambiguity in the way they present the Old Belief, because I mean, it's a little bit different from the Native American situation in that when Nadezhdin and Melnikov-Pechersky looked at the Old Believers, they saw Russians.
Yeah.
They saw Russianness preserved in its most elemental historical form. And so it was, I mean, I guess you could think of it as kind of salvage ethnography as well, where they want to record what, and Nadezhdin actually, he compliments the residents of Bila Krynica and says they actually, first of all, they're more sober and upright and less drunkenness than any Russians you would find in Russia itself, and they've preserved Russian folklore, Russian ways, Russian traditions in ways that you would never find in Central Russia among the peasantry. So in some ways, the Old Believers are better Russians than the Russian peasants themselves. They just happen to have this, this crazy religion. And, it's not even so much he thinks that the religion is crazy, because originally religion is orthodoxy in its sort of pure, earlier form. So it is their defiance of authority that is the problem.
Yeah. Fascinating, thank you. And it makes me think that, and maybe this has already been done, I don't know about it, but a book about non-Old Believers, fantasies about Old Believers would be interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is that Ilya? Did you?
Yeah, Ilya.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Nathaniel and Bella. I found this discussion so fascinating. I have a somewhat odd question. Nathaniel, your discussion of the of one of them, I'm not sure if it was the fifth or the fourth necessary condition for rehabilitation is I may be misquoting, but this has something to do with the abandonment or the abnegation of the will, right? The idea that somehow this individual's act, the act of individual will or relying on one's own reason is somehow transgressive, right? And ultimately should be given up in favor of the authority of the state. And this reminded me very much of this moment in Belinsky, right? The famous reconciliation with actuality, right? in the 30s, late 30s, early 40s, and the two have a curious connection, right? That, you know, Belinsky in a way is Nadezhdin's protege, right? Belinsky experiences this conversion when he comes to Petersburg, which is where Nadezhdin is located, right? That's where at that point already he is in St. Petersburg at the журнал Министерства народного просвещения. Is that right?
Well, it's the внутренний дел, actually.
Внутренних дел, sorry,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's-
внутренних дел.
yeah.
And so, right, and so then have you found any echoes have you found Nadezhdin's reactions to the scandalous event of Belinsky's reconciliation, scandalous from the point of view of the left Hegelians among the Russians, right? But probably, I imagine, approved of by someone like Nadezhdin, with his very similar.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's one that really requires a little bit more research.
Yes.
But there are some hints. You know, sir, I mean, I think it's certainly plausible to think that Nadezhdin and Belinsky, who were in, you know, daily contact, working together up until the Chaadaev affair, may have been kind of on a similar trajectory in their understanding of philosophy. And, you know, it's right at the moment of the Hegelian turn, you know, and Nadezhdin really came out steeped in Schelling, but he knew Hegel as well. And in some ways, this is kind of putting philosophy in this more Hegelian direction, with this reconciliation with reality and with the state as the ultimate end point of the dialectic, you know. And so it, you know, so it does make sense. And the other person who goes through this transformation is Konstantin Aksakov, who is, you know, someone who Nadezhdin knew very well. He had been a student of Nadezhdin at Moscow University, and Nadezhdin was very close to the entire Aksakov family, and he was practically a member of the household. And so, you know, and I think, well, I know there's a break between Nadezhdin and Belinsky during the Chaadaev affair, and afterwards, I think it's because Belinsky hears something through Konstantin Aksakov that leads him to believe that Nadezhdin had shared compromising information about him with the inquiry, and therefore put him under suspicion. And in fact, Belinsky had actually written something that Nadezhdin had actually pulled back from publication, thinking it would get the journal in trouble just before the Chaadaev affair. And so I don't remember exactly what it was, but nonetheless, you know, that's really the reason for their rift. But I think that there's some of his letters to Aksakov, to Sergei Aksakov, there's a little bit of, you know, this sort of bewilderment, like, oh my goodness, what is this, you know, Konstantin? And he was concerned about Belinsky as well. You know, how is he feeding himself? Belinsky was really living hand to mouth, and practically starving during, you know, 1837, 1838. So when they get to Petersburg, I think by this time, Belinsky had recovered from his recovery from reality and is writing more radical stuff and associating with more radical sources. And the two have, you know, completely separate. There's a letter from Nadezhdin to Aksakov where he mentions that he met Belinsky at a party and was obliged to shake his hand, but didn't say a word with him for the rest of the evening. So clearly, you know, there's this sort of frosty
Parting of ways here, right?
Yeah, parting of the ways. And it's not just with Belinsky as well. I think once Nadezhdin enters the state bureaucracy, his literary associations really fall away. He was a good friend of Krajewski before that. There's not any correspondence with that. He was a friend of Ivan Panin, and they're not in touch much after that point. Even his friendship with Aksakov, Sergei Aksakov, which had really been fundamental, you know, something happens between them. There's some kind, one of these frustrating things about seeing letters in the archives is you never know the full story, but there was some kind of scandal between them that led to a break by around 1844, 1845. So he, you know, so he, his literary connections really fall by the wayside. And so anyhow, I don't know if that answers your
Thank you.
question completely, but it's a really fascinating point.
I see a hand here from Eugene Clay. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Thanks for Nathaniel. It was a really fascinating talk. I do want to say that the old believers that Nadezhdin persecuted are now, you know, one of the recognized religious organizations in, you know, the centralized religious organizations in the Russian Federation, with hundreds actually of parishes, 17 dioceses, one of them in Uganda. So thinking about, and the Metropolitan Corneli is a former communist. He was a member of the Communist Party, but the leader, and now of course he's an old believer, and he's quite supportive of the the invasion of Ukraine. So he's somebody I think who's you know, using the same networking tools that Nadezhdin was using. But I wanted to, oh, and if you want to visit their center, of course, the center is in Rogozhskaya Kladbyshe in Moscow. So it's really quite magnificent. But I wanted to ask you if about the couple of questions that came up, and maybe this question of narodnost is especially important for the old believers, because in fact, it seems to me like the old believers get reincorporated into kind of conservative Russian discourse. You know, in the 1840s, they're like this Austrian enemy, and of course throughout the 19th century, they're often identified by the church as Austrians, right? This is the Austrian, and then they become the real Russians. These are the real Russians who preserved real Russian culture, and most of the there's a whole kind of school of Soviet ethnographers and text people who work on text who really are motivated by this idea of recovering the real Russians that the Soviet period you know, eliminated. And maybe the best of them, I guess, would be Nikolai Nikolaevich Pokrovsky or V.A. Malyshev a little earlier. So in terms of the project that Bella was talking about, you know, this question of narodnost, of recovering narodnost, I was wondering if you might have some reflections on, you know, is Nadezhdin also trying to recover? You say he's the Rusins, he's very interested in the Rusins because they're real Russians, and yet of course he as you say, in order to get rehabilitated fully, he's willing to sacrifice them. So I was wondering if you had some if you might answer more fully Bella's excellent question about this question of ethnography being about the margins, and or about, you know, and narodnost being about the kind of center. Anyway, thank you so much for this fantastic talk.
Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, good to bring me back to Bella's question, which really was a great question. We had a little more chance to think about it, but you know, I think that there is this almost schizophrenic ambivalence in Nadezhdin's view of the old believer, and I think it's reflected in the dichotomy between the official nationality conception of narodnost coming from Uvarov and Nadezhdin's own concept of narodnost, which he had articulated going all the way back to his writings in the 1830s. And basically, the Ovarov conception of narodnost is essentially tautological. In other words, narodnost is defined through the loyalty and devotion of subjects to their ruler, right? And that is what defines a Russian in the language of official nationality. And Nadezhdin understood this very well, and we know he understood it because during the Chaadaev affair, when he tries to justify himself, he actually puts out a justification in precisely those terms, saying that what he was attempting to do by publishing Chaadaev was to beat down this notion of an independent Russianness existing separately as a thing in itself, outside of its relationship to the autocrat. Right. And that only narodnost can only be a product of being part of the empire and loyal and devoted to the autocrat. On the other hand, this idea of this independent notion of narodnost existing as a self-contained thing in itself was precisely what Nadezhdin believed in his own Russia writings. It's what he had written about in detail in his major article in 1836 and continued to believe. And when he takes on ethnography, the particular point that he emphasizes is the study of the ethnographic studies of Russians as Russians. And there's a tug of war in the Geographical Society in the first years between the German elite and Karl von Baer, who's the first chair of the ethnographic division, who wants to study these little-known disappearing peoples of the empire, and Nadezhdin, who wants to study Russians, and precisely to kind of tease out the particular attributes of Russianness, in a sense, what makes Russians Russianness, in a sense, giving Russians their place within the empire, giving Russian narodnost its place within the empire. And that is contradictory to the position he took in the Chaadaev affair, and it's contradictory to his own actions, as an investigator of the old belief. So here you see this idea of the negation of the will, right? And doing not what he actually believes or what he thinks, but doing what is the will from above. And he actually used the phrase, there's an interesting confrontation between Ivan Aksakov and Nadezhdin in 1848, when Aksakov, who was now working for the Ministry of Internal Affairs and was also involved in investigating the old believers, confronted Nadezhdin and said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you raising so much animosity? And these are good people and they're Russians." And Nadezhdin said, basically, all he could say, "It's not my will. It's the will of, it's the will of the state." And but yet as an ethnographer, as a scholar, he could still pursue this idea of narodnost as something that existed on its own, something that had its own integrity, its own existence. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of the way I see it. It's like bifurcated consciousness or something. It's, yeah.
I'm looking for more hands. That was such a thought-provoking presentation, and the comments were really rich. I want to make sure we're not missing anybody. Yeah, Nathaniel, thank you so much, and Bella, thank you. We're very close to our end time, unless I see another hand. And again, this was fantastically rich, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It was a pleasure. I
Yeah.
appreciate the comments and the questions.
Thanks. Bye.
Nice to see everyone. Take care.